I'm walking on eggshells. Oh, I'm walking on eggshells. Oh, and I feel. Welcome to The Big Puzzle. In this podcast, we explore the subtle connections between science, religion, politics, economics, and history. One piece at a time, we unveil the big picture of this shared experience that we call life. Well, today I'm in Porter's Park in Rexburg, Idaho. Not really walking on eggshells, but mostly snow. Wearing my cultural appropriated cowboy hat. And I guess that enables people from America to go and get Argentinian citizenship and, take some videos drinking mate and dancing tango and playing soccer, I guess. So today I wanted to continue a little with this idea that I presented last time about this existence being a simulation. And there will be several introductory videos that explains why I see that, why I believe that. It's a personal belief. It's not my religious belief or anything, but it's connected somehow with my religious beliefs. So I wanted to expand a little about transistors. So in the last video, I mentioned how transistors really revolutionized the technology, especially computers, make them actually feasible, and I want to explain a little more about that because most people probably don't even know how computers work. So in the simplest possible definition of a computer is a bunch of very tiny wires, billions of wires. So some of those wires are charged with electricity and some of them are not. And they change through time. Sometimes those wires that are charged get discharged and vice versa. So when we talk about charge, we're talking about little differences in voltage. So voltage is how you measure the potential electric energy in the wire. And you probably can think of a battery that has 1.5 volts or whatever. Well, in the case of electronics, in computers, we're talking about sometimes it's 3.3, sometimes it's 5, there are some other cases. So it's a tiny difference in voltage, right? So all those billions of tiny wires are the ones that perform all the calculations and all the things that we're doing now. So to get to some of the nomenclature, sometimes we call those wires to be on if they're charged, or off if they're not charged, or being high or low, depending again if they're charged or not. But mostly you've heard about computers using ones and zeros. So one is basically a charged wire, and zero is a non-charged wire. But how do they change? How do you make them go from being charged to discharged and so on? How do they perform the calculations? Well, that's the interesting part. And basically it's because that each wire can be triggered by other wire. Right? So basically you have wires that activate switches on other wires. Basically like a light switch, but instead of being a person switching it on and off, there's a wire that when it's charged, it turns the switch on, and then the other wire gets charged and so on. So we could do that for a long time before the transistor were discovered or invented. One way that you could do that is to use actual mechanical electric switches that are called relays. So a relay basically is a little electromagnet that moves a rod, the magnetized rod, and if you put that on a switch, it will turn it on and off. So you put charge here, it will go up and turn the other wire on. So why don't we use those? Well, first of all, they're big, they're slow. There's no way that you could put 1 billion, not even 1 million, not even 1,000 relays working together. And also, since they're mechanical, they have wearing parts, and you need to be able to replace them. So it's not a feasible solution for a computer, only for very, very basic applications, right? So later on, somebody said, well, we could invent something that is electronic instead of mechanical. And that's what the vacuum tubes were. So the vacuum tubes basically had grids that when the grid is charged, it wouldn't allow a flow of electrons to pass, right? So that's, in a nutshell, what a vacuum valve is. And why vacuum? Because those have to happen in a vacuum. So there's a glass thing with a vacuum inside, and the grid and the anode and cathode and everything. But basically it's that you apply voltage, you apply you turn it on, right, the wire that feeds the vacuum tube, and then it would allow the other wire or the switch on to let the other wire to get charged as well. So that's how vacuum tubes work. So why don't we use them? Well, they are fast, so way faster, but they still have the issue with the size. They're kind of big, and also they turn to burn really fast. So if you have, I don't know, 1,000 vacuum tubes, like I mentioned in the previous video, you need somebody just going around figuring out which ones are burned, changing them. They're kind of expensive. So yeah, when we didn't have anything better, basically that's what we did, right? So World War II, the first computers actually used vacuum tubes. But still, they're not, you can't reduce them in size, and that was the main issue. So up to that point, we had two types of materials. So the materials that were conductors of electricity, I think of copper, or think of iron, or any metal that electricity can go through. And you have non-conductive elements, right? That would actually stop the electrons could not flow through those. But then they discover the properties of some new materials that are semiconductors. So under certain conditions, they can become conductors, and if you remove those conditions, they become non-conductors. So that's how they build the transistors. The transistors are sandwiches of some of those materials, right? And if you provide voltage, if you turn on one of the wires in the sandwich, that will allow the electricity to go through, right? And that's basically a transistor. Now, since it's just materials and sandwiches, you can reduce them more and more and more to become, well, really at an atomic level. So you could put first hundreds, then thousands, millions, and now we're talking about billions of transistors in a circuit, connecting all these wires and letting one wire turn other wires on and off and so on. Right? So that is basically what a computer is. It's a bunch of wires with switches, and those switches are transistors. Well, but that doesn't explain how they actually work. Why would you turn wires on and off? So what's the advantage there? So let me talk a little about the next thing, that is the logic. How do you make all those wires and transistors do something? And let's start with the very basic one. So they're called logic gates. So there are different ways to combine these transistors to make things happen. Let's say that the most basic one is that you want to do what is called an AND gate. Right? An AND gate means that if these two wires are ones, I want this other wire to also be on. The way you do that is that you grab your wire, right? There's charge on this end, but you put one transistor here and one transistor there. Right? So you put them in series. Now, if only this transistor is on, it will allow the electricity to go through it, but if this one is off, then it won't go anymore. So both of them have to be on, right, for the electricity to charge this one. So if this is charged and this is charged, this one will be charged. So that is an AND gate, right, because both this and this wire have to be one on high to let this be one on high. What about if you only want one of those two wires to be on? That's what is called an OR gate. So in the OR gate, what you do is you grab that first wire that there's charge up here, and you split it in two. And then you connect them back. And in each of these branches, you connect the other two transistors, the other two wires through the transistor. So if this one is on, the electricity will just follow this path, and this one will be on. If the other one is on, it will take the other path, and still, at the end, it will be on. If both are on, well, electricity would take both. But if both are off, then the electricity doesn't have a path, so this one is off. So that's an OR gate. Now you can start combining them, and an OR, and then this OR, and you can make some other interesting stuff. So some other gates that are commonly used are the NOT. So if a wire is on, the other wire is off, and vice versa. There's the NAND and NOR, not and not OR gates, that are basically an AND but reverse, that instead of on turns off, and so on. Then you have the XOR, right? And I won't go into detail because, well, you can look at anywhere. I'm just trying to explain how the building blocks work. Now, with all these gates combined in different ways, you can do some interesting stuff. For instance, you can create something that is called a flip-flop. So a flip-flop has two exit wires. One is on and the other is off. And every time that you turn this on, it will switch, the on and the off. So that's what is called a flip-flop. Every time that receive a high voltage, voltage here, so when this wire is on, they will switch. You can also create something that is very useful. It's called latches. So latches are basically, they have two inputs. One that sets the latch, right, and again it has two outputs. One is on and the other is off, and the other wire resets it, right? So all these things you can combine even more to create some basic. And now we're talking about circuits, and the name circuit has to do with that. We had how to make the electricity circulate, right? That's circuit. And you could do something that is called a half adder, and then you combine those half adders to have an adder. And the adder actually does what the name says. It adds numbers. So if you provide through wires, and we will see how, the number 3, and then you provide the number 4 through through wires, then you will get at the end the number 7. And those are kind of the most basic things that you can do with with these basic circuits and the logic gates and the transistors and so on. So there's another important concept to consider. So how do we synchronize everything? Imagine you're inside of the computer, some wires are on and off, things are turning on and off. So every computer has a synchronizer that is called a clock, just because it's constantly ticking, right? And what the clock is technically is a square wave, right? That basically turns on, off, on, off. But what is most useful is when they change from on to off, that produces a pulse, kind of a spike in volume. And that is the spike that it's used to tell all the circuits, okay, calculate the new state. Calculate the new state. So a computer is it works in a discrete way. It doesn't work in a continuous way. So it has all the wires are at certain states, some are on and off, and then the clock say, okay, now based on this configuration, based on this state, calculate the next state. So some wires will change from on to off, and then the clock again does that over and over. That allows the computer to work as one and to know when it has to read data, when it has to process the data, when it has to write the results. So it synchronizes the whole thing. You can think it kind of a military parade, right? So somebody is marking the pace. Instead of, we will talk about this later, no, not today, but some other time, our brains, we don't have a clock that we know in our brains. So neurons are just flashing all over the place all the time. And that's kind of just a walking crowd compared to the parade. So that's the difference between our brains and the computer. The computer are synchronized by that clock. How often does the clock tick? Very often. So now you probably heard about something measured in gigahertz. That side note should be gigahertz because it's the same root as gigantic, right? Or giant. But, well, we say gigahertz in English for whatever reason. That means that there's 1 billion ticks. Each gigahertz is 1 billion ticks a second. That's the beauty of electronics. Things happen pretty much at the speed of light. So you can run things really, really fast. But, again, it's not continuous. It's not constantly running, it happens, things happen with the ticks of the clock. And what happens in the period where the clock is not ticking? Well, nothing. But as I mentioned, you need those pulses to happen, and those take some time. So that's why we cannot reduce it more and more. There's kind of a physical limit, based on physics, of how fast it can run, and we're kind of reaching those limits. The other thing that we're reaching the limit is in the size of these sandwiches, the transistors. So why is there a limit there? Well, because when you go too small, quantum mechanics, quantum physics become relevant. And one of the things that quantum physics tells us is that you cannot know exactly where a particle is. So everything becomes to be full, you cannot know the position and the velocity. But in practical sense, you cannot know exactly where something is. It's about the probability. So there's a probability that an electron is in a certain place. And when distances are too small, that electron can jump. So everything gets weird in quantum physics, right? So, but try to understand. Sometimes that electron can jump the transistor because the transistor is too small. And the probability of that electron being here, even if it's small, it's not null. So instead of you're planning it to be here, but suddenly it appears here and it goes. So that adds kind of a hard limit to transistors. And we are reaching there. You can still work on the architecture, make all these combinations of logic gates better. There's room for improvement, definitely. I'm not an expert like in everything that I say. I'm not an expert in any of this, but I understand enough that there is still opportunity to make our CPUs and GPUs and all our processors better. But we are reaching those kind of hard limits by physics. One thing I forgot to mention is also, what happens when you turn off the computer, right? And that electricity, that voltage that it's actually propagated in the different wires, it's turned off. Well, we can use tiny magnets, very tiny magnets, and put them north and south and turn them around based on the 1 and 0s, on the highs and lows, and those magnets become permanent until you change them again. So you store all the 0s and 1s from the voltage into tiny magnets, and that's what we call a memory. right? So memory is actually a magnetic representation of zeros and ones, and instead of using high and low voltage, it's using north and south poles of the magnet. So that's something that is also important in computers. That's why sometimes computers don't get along with magnets very much. There's obviously some other ways to do this, and science and technology so is always growing. But well, if we now understand how a computer basically works, how all this complexity adds to gets stuck in one on top of the other, and and at the end you have all this complex behavior, like recording this video. There's a lot of ones and zeros moving around inside this tiny phone to have this video being recorded. But one thing I want to get as a takeaway from this video, talking to the long goal of a simulation, is that computers are not good at continuous processes. And we explain why. So for instance, when I talk about the adder, I said that, well, these wires would send a 3 and these wires would send a 4, and then you will get a 7. And that is because you can turn zeros and ones into integer numbers. That's what they call a binary representation of a number. So in binary, the number 0 is 0, the number 1 is 1, the number 2, since you don't have more numbers in the binary, you need to go to the next possible number, that is 1, 0. Right? So number 2 is actually 10 in binary. Number 3 is 11. Number 4 is 100, and so on. But you can always do that transformation between binary numbers and decimal numbers. But one thing that you cannot do is to represent non-integral numbers, let's say. So, for instance, you can never represent 1.3 in binary. There's no decimal or 1.761. There's no way to represent that. There are some ways that you can come close to that, in sometimes exactly close, but it's just by creating basically division of numbers. So you have two integer numbers, right? And okay, if I divide these two numbers, I will get this number. It's a way to represent non-integer numbers, which doesn't work for irrational numbers. For instance, pi. Pi has infinite number of digits, and there's no way for a computer to represent that completely. So they just decide how many digits do we need, and we use that. Right? And for all practical purposes and even scientific purposes, that's enough. But you cannot represent irrational numbers, the square root of 2 or 3 or any of irrational numbers cannot be represented with binary representation. And the other one is that you cannot calculate processes that are continuous. Let's say that you want to use a computer to represent a bouncing ball. So the physics are very simple, you know how it works, so you know where the position is of the ball at each time. Well, here's the problem. The position requires a continuous variable, so because the ball actually goes through all the possible positions, and you cannot find those numbers using binary. But to make things worse, the computer can only calculate based on the clock. So it can calculate the approximate position of the ball at different steps. And if it's fast enough, we will not be able to tell the difference, right, with our senses. But in reality, and that's kind of a hint of what I'm going to talk sometime, in reality, the ball could be in any position at any time, and you cannot represent that in a computer. Is that so, though? Okay, think about that. So that's pretty much the the goal for this video is to introduce to this concept, to explain how computers work, so then later we can use that as an analogy of how things work in our brains, in reality, in this that I call a simulation. And hopefully things will make sense later. So I think this has been long enough. I hope it was not boring enough. I hope to see you in the next one. If you like this, please again share with people who might find these things interesting. Also subscribe so you know when I publish the next one. And yeah, hope to see you in the next one.